The chipped formica of the diner counter still felt warm under my elbows. I'd finished the last of the coffee, a weak, metallic brew, and was trying to mentally sort through the bills. Connie, the waitress, had given me an extra packet of sugar, knowing I always took 2 in my coffee. Small kindnesses felt enormous these days. It was 6:53 p.m., and I was already calculating how much of this paycheck would go straight to the hospital. Another $1,800, just to keep the collection agency from calling Sarah again. The observatory loomed at the end of a long gravel driveway. It wasn't majestic, not like those pictures you see of sprawling mountain observatories. This was functional. A concrete cylinder mostly, with a low flat roof and a smattering of satellite dishes bolted onto the sides. It looked like a giant abandoned grain silo. The air smelled like pine needles and something else, something acrid and faintly chemical, like old batteries. Ilse, the daytime operator, was already gone. A set of keys and a manila envelope were taped to the inside of the front door, along with a note that simply said, "Welcome, Elian." The main room was dominated by the telescope itself, a hulking metal beast that filled almost the entire space. It smelled like oil and dust in here, and the air was cool, even for October. The concrete floor was worn smooth in places, scuffed in others. There were a few mismatched chairs scattered around, and a desk cluttered with logbooks, charts, and a half-eaten bag of pretzels. A computer monitor glowed with a complex array of data, lines and graphs scrolling across the screen. It was quiet, a deep humming quiet that pressed against your ears. I made a mental note to check the heating system. It was colder than I expected. The pay was good enough that I hoped it wouldn't be too expensive to run. I found the envelope and tore it open. Inside were 10 sheets of paper, typed in a plain, sans serif font. Each sheet contained a single numbered rule. 1. If furniture or equipment has been moved overnight from its established position, log it, but do not move it back. Work around it. I frowned. That was odd, like someone had a particularly fussy cleaning crew. 2. If asked directly whether you have seen or heard anything unusual, say no. Do not qualify hedge or describe what you saw. Just no. Okay, now that was just weird. What kind of job was this? Some kind of social experiment? 3. Whoever leaves last must perform the following before exiting. Check every light switch, say each room aloud, walk the perimeter once. Do not leave without completing it. This felt like something a homeowner would do, not a professional observatory. A little superstitious. 4. Do not use the service entrance alone. If no one is available to accompany you, use the main entrance regardless of inconvenience. I glanced at a door I hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the back of the room. It looked like it led to some kind of utility corridor. Probably just a safety thing, I figured. 5. Never stand in any doorway on the premises. Pass through completely or stay on one side. A person standing in a doorway belongs to neither space. This one made me chuckle. A little too much folklore for my taste. Probably some old operator's quirk. 6. If the lights go out, stay exactly where you are. Do not use a flashlight or your phone light. Wait for them to come back on. Now that was impractical. A power outage in the middle of the night and you just wait in the dark. 7. After 1 a.m., ride the elevator facing away from the doors. Do not turn around until the doors open at your floor. I hadn't even noticed there was an elevator. There was a small utilitarian car tucked away to the side of the telescope. This rule felt unsettling, even though I immediately dismissed it. Probably just a joke. I imagined some bored employee playing a prank on new hires. 8. At 2 a.m., check the roof access door. If it is unlocked, lock it. Do not look up before securing it. Do not check what may be on the roof. That was specific. And the do not look up part was particularly strange. I imagined a bird's nest or something. 9. When making the closing announcement, use only the exact written script. Do not improvise. Do not add personal phrasing. Do not vary the wording. I wondered what the closing announcement even was. 10. Do not wear any fragrance, perfume, cologne, scented lotion on the premises. Wear only unscented products. I didn't even wear cologne. Sarah was the one who liked perfume. Still, I made a mental note to double-check my laundry detergent. I read through the list again, a knot forming in my stomach. It was a lot of rules. Eccentric, to say the least. Probably just a weird workplace culture. Old man Walt, Ilse had mentioned, had worked here for 40 years and was something of a legend. Maybe these were his rules. My priority was keeping this job. Sarah needed the insurance. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. I had work to do. The telescope hummed. I started the pre-shift checklist, verifying the alignment, calibrating the sensors, logging the atmospheric conditions. As I worked, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible scent in the air. Not the battery smell from outside, but something sweeter, cloying, like overripe fruit, just on the edge of rotting. It wasn't strong enough to be unpleasant, just present. I checked the air vents, but they seemed clean. I made another note to ask Ilse about it tomorrow. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, using the small, dented percolator I'd brought from home. The observatory's coffee tasted like burnt dust. It wasn't the caffeine I craved so much as the ritual, the warmth of the mug in my hands, the momentary distraction from the bills piling up on the kitchen table. Sarah had been home for 6 months now, but the physical therapy was slow, expensive, and the insurance company was constantly questioning their coverage. Every claim felt like a battle. It was just past 3 a.m., and the telescope was quiet, focused on a distant nebula. I had to manually log the atmospheric pressure every hour, a tedious task, but it was part of the checklist. I pulled up the digital log on the computer, a green screen flickering in the dim light. The room smelled faintly of ozone and old metal. The scent was almost comforting, a constant presence in this isolated place. I finished the log entry and started on the equipment check. The small storage room off the main observation deck held spare parts, tools, and various calibration devices. It wasn't organized particularly well, but I'd spent the last shift familiarizing myself with the layout, mentally cataloging where everything went. A large, industrial metal shelving unit dominated one wall, holding boxes of sensors, cables, and optical filters. That's when I noticed it. The shelving unit was off. Not drastically, but noticeably. It had been flush against the wall. I was certain of it. I remembered squeezing past it yesterday, carefully maneuvering around the edge. Now it was pulled forward, maybe 6 inches, and angled slightly to the left, facing more towards the center of the room. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was enough to be jarring. There were no wheel marks on the concrete floor. The shelving unit was heavy, incredibly heavy. It would have taken significant effort to move it even a few inches. I ran a hand along the base, feeling for any scuff marks, anything that might indicate how it had been shifted. Nothing. The floor was clean, undisturbed. For a moment, I just stared at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe I hadn't noticed it yesterday. Maybe Ilse had moved it, and I hadn't paid attention. But Ilse had been meticulous. She'd shown me everything, and she wouldn't have left it angled like that. It felt intentional. It was probably just settling. The building was old. The floor wasn't perfectly level. A slight tremor, a shift in the foundation could account for it. I needed to access a specific calibration tool on the top shelf. If I moved the shelving unit back, it would be easy. I could get the tool, finish the check, and forget the whole thing. Then the crumpled piece of paper in my pocket felt like a weight. Old man Walt's rules. I dug it out, smoothing it with my fingers. Rule 13. If furniture or equipment has been moved overnight from its established position, log it, but do not move it back. Work around it. Work around it. I read it again, a cold feeling creeping into my stomach. It wasn't a logical rule. It didn't make sense. But I remembered the anxiety in Walt's voice when Ilse described handing over the shift. A silent warning. I glanced at the top shelf, at the tool I needed. It was just out of reach. I could stand on a chair, but it was unstable. It would be safer to just move the shelving unit. But I didn't. I logged the discrepancy in the maintenance log, noting the approximate distance and angle of the shift. It felt ridiculous, meticulously documenting a minor rearrangement of furniture. I spent the next 20 minutes awkwardly reaching for the calibration tool, stretching and contorting my body, nearly losing my balance several times. I finally managed to snag it with the handle of a screwdriver, nearly knocking over a box of delicate sensors in the process. It was frustrating, inefficient, and utterly pointless. I could have had it in seconds if I'd just ignored the rule. But something held me back. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense that doing it the easy way would be wrong. I finished the equipment check, a dull ache developing in my shoulder. As I walked back to the observation deck, I realized I hadn't logged the exact atmospheric pressure at 4 a.m. I'd been so focused on navigating around the shifted shelving unit that I'd missed the time. I made a note to correct it during the next cycle, but the thought of a missing data point, a small imperfection in the record, lingered. It was a small thing, but Sarah had always stressed the importance of accuracy. It felt bad. The star charts were a mess. Not literally, they were digitally rendered and displayed on the monitor, but the data coming in was scattered. There had been some solar flare activity. Ilse had mentioned it in her handover notes, but it was impacting the clarity of the readings more than I'd anticipated. I was spending the bulk of my time filtering noise, trying to isolate the true signals from the static. It was tedious work, the kind that made your eyes ache and your brain feel like cotton. I'd brewed another pot of coffee, the cheap stuff from the break room, and was meticulously scrolling through a series of spectral analyses, adjusting the gain on the receiver. The observatory was quiet, a low hum from the cooling fans and the occasional creak of the dome as it shifted with the temperature. It was a comforting sound, a reminder that even in this isolated place, things were functioning as they should. I'd put on Nick Drake's Pink Moon, the vinyl crackle a familiar counterpoint to the digital hiss from the telescope. Around 3:15 a.m., Connie called. I almost didn't answer. Calls during a shift were rare. Usually, it was just Walt checking in to make sure I hadn't locked myself out or accidentally shut down the power. But the caller ID showed Connie, the administrative assistant. She handled payroll, benefits, all the paperwork. Elian, sorry to bother you so late. Her voice was crisp and professional. No problem, Connie. Everything all right? Just checking in. Ilse said you were starting tonight. How are things going? Quiet. A little static from a solar flare, but manageable. It's peaceful. I hated small talk, especially on the phone. Good, good. Ilse mentioned she was a bit worried about leaving you with everything. She said you seemed stressed during the handover. Everything okay at home? I shifted in my chair, the vinyl of Pink Moon cycling through its quiet melancholy. Sarah was sleeping, hopefully. The medication was helping, but the nightmares still came. The medical bills were a constant weight. Everything's fine, Connie. Just adjusting to a new routine. There was a pause. Then, she said it. Have you noticed anything unusual up there? Ilse said the acoustics can play tricks on you, and sometimes things just feel off. Anything like that? My hand tightened around the coffee mug. The sweet, decaying smell, faint but persistent, almost seemed to intensify. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific, just present. I remembered the crumpled paper in my pocket, the rigid formality of Walt's instructions, Rule 13. No, just say no. No, I said, my voice flat. Everything's normal. Another pause. It felt longer this time, stretched and uncomfortable. I could practically feel Connie's gaze through the phone line, assessing, questioning. Okay, she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Just checking. Let me know if anything comes up. Will do. I hung up the phone, my ears ringing. The music seemed louder now, almost frantic. It wasn't the question itself that bothered me. It was the silence that followed my answer, a silence that felt wrong. I glanced around the observation deck, everything appearing exactly as it should. The monitors glowed, displaying their streams of data. The telescope hummed softly, the dome rotated slowly, tracking the stars, but then I saw it. On the far side of the deck, near the access panel for the emergency generator, a shadow. Not a distinct shape, more like a distortion of the light. It flickered at the periphery of my vision, too quick to focus on. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was still there, a subtle warping of the air, like heat rising off asphalt on a hot summer day. Except it wasn't hot. The observatory was cool, almost frigid. I stared at it for a long time, trying to rationalize it. A trick of the light. A reflection from the dome. Some kind of optical illusion caused by the atmospheric distortion. It was probably nothing. But it didn't go away, and it didn't feel like nothing. I checked the generator panel. It was sealed and locked. The access log showed no entries for the past week. There was no logical explanation for what I was seeing. The shadow wasn't cast by anything. It simply was. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, the bitterness doing little to calm the tremor in my hands. I logged the time, 3:22 a.m., in the maintenance log, and made a note, possible visual anomaly near generator panel. Investigate further. I didn't mention the shadow. I didn't describe it. I just noted the possibility of something being amiss. I'd said no to Connie. I'd logged a factual observation. I'd followed the rules. But as I returned to the star charts, the sweet, decaying smell grew stronger, and the feeling that I wasn't alone intensified. The music felt wrong now, too mournful, too knowing. I needed to check the roof. Walt had emphasized the roof check in the handover notes. It was a standard procedure, but something told me it was more important tonight. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the access ladder. The image of that flickering shadow burned into the back of my eyelids. The quiet wasn't comforting anymore. It was waiting. I was recalibrating the spectrograph. It's a tedious process, tweaking the alignment, running diagnostics, and making sure the readings are accurate. Walt had shown me how, step by step, but it still felt like trying to tune a radio with boxing gloves on. The little screws were so small, the adjustments so minute. I kept dropping the wrench, and each time it clattered against the metal housing, it echoed in the cavernous room, making me jump. It was almost 6 a.m. The longest stretch of the night, when the cold seemed to seep into your bones. I'd put on another record, Elliott Smith's Either Or. It felt appropriate, quiet, melancholy. Sarah liked him too, though she preferred Nick Drake. We used to sit on the floor listening to vinyl, the needle crackling softly. It felt like a lifetime ago. The medical bills, they consumed everything. Even the music couldn't quite reach through the weight of them. The spectrograph finally seemed stable. The readings were within acceptable parameters. I logged the calibration in the system, double-checking the time and date. Routine, just routine. The observatory was always routine until it wasn't. I glanced at the clock again. 6:17 a.m., almost time to start the shutdown sequence. I finished a final sweep of the observation deck, making sure all the instruments were properly stowed. The shadow from last night was gone, or at least I didn't see it. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a fleeting hallucination brought on by fatigue and too much coffee. It was easy enough to believe. I was tired. I hadn't slept properly in weeks. The stress was getting to me. Then I remembered. Walt's handover notes. The last person out. There was a specific procedure. Something about lights and rooms and walking the perimeter. It was vague in my memory, frustratingly so. I couldn't recall the exact order, just a general sense of it being thorough. It felt less like a safety protocol and more like an appeasement, a way of acknowledging the space, of letting it know you were leaving. I dismissed it initially as the eccentricities of an old man, but Connie's phone call, the shadow, it all felt connected now. I found the handwritten note tucked into the observatory log. Last out ritual, below it, a list. 1. Check every light switch. 2. Say each room aloud. 3. Walk the perimeter once. Simple enough. Annoying, but simple. I started with the lights, flicking them off one by one, moving from the observation deck to the control room, then down the narrow corridor towards the entrance. Each click of the switch echoed in the silence. Then the rooms. Observation deck. Control room. Generator room. My voice sounded hollow, unnatural. I felt ridiculous, muttering to an empty building. And then I realized I'd skipped the storage room. It was small, tucked away near the entrance, filled with old equipment and discarded supplies. I'd walked past it, intending to do it last, and then forgotten. I stood there, debating. Going back felt like inviting something in, but not doing it. The note had been insistent. Do not leave without completing it. I sighed, the air catching in my throat. It was just a room, just a light switch. I retraced my steps, quickly, almost running. Flipped the switch in the storage room. Storage room? Done. The ritual was complete. Or so I thought. As I stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, locking the heavy metal door behind me, I remembered the final step, the perimeter. Walking around the entire building, it wasn't just about the rooms inside, it was about the building itself. I was halfway down the driveway, already starting the engine of my car, when it hit me, the perimeter. I hadn't walked the perimeter. A cold knot formed in my stomach. It wasn't a logical fear, not exactly. It wasn't that something would happen if I didn't. It was the feeling of incompleteness, of a door left slightly ajar. I killed the engine, the silence of the countryside pressing in around me. I stared back at the observatory, a dark silhouette against the lightening sky. It looked expectant. I didn't turn around. I didn't walk back. I couldn't. I just put the car in drive and headed home. The image of that looming building imprinted on my mind, and the distinct impression of something watching me go. The chipped formica of the break room table felt cool under my forearms. I was trying to coax a decent cup of coffee from the ancient machine, the kind that gurgled and spat more than brewed. It was 6:15, and I'd used the last 10 minutes of my break fiddling with the grounds, adjusting the filter, hoping for something that tasted less like burnt dirt. I needed it. Last night had been unsettling. Not because of anything specific, just a general sense of being off-kilter. I'd chalked it up to exhaustion, to the lingering stress about Sarah's bills. The observatory was quiet, even for this hour. Usually Ilse would be in, already prepping the data logs, muttering about the inconsistencies in the atmospheric readings. Not today. I finally got a cup that was marginally drinkable, a weak, brownish liquid. I added a splash of the powdered creamer, stirring until it dissolved into a murky swirl. It wasn't great, but it was warm. I scrolled through the news on my phone while I drank, mostly grim headlines about the economy and another round of hospital closures. Sarah's physical therapy was going to be affected, I knew it, another expense to worry about. I felt a tightness in my chest, a familiar ache. I needed to get to work, get the telescope calibrated, and just focus. The shift report from Walt, the overnight operator before me, was terse as usual. All systems nominal, minor drift on the azimuth axis, check alignment before first observation. I scanned it quickly, making a mental note. The azimuth axis. Right. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, and headed back towards the control room. That's when I remembered the conference call. 9 a.m. sharp, a mandatory meeting with the regional director about budget cuts. Wonderful. Just what I needed. I glanced at my watch, 6:45. Plenty of time to get everything up and running. Except, I realized I'd left the file with the updated star charts in my car. It was a thick binder, essential for tonight's scheduled observations. I cursed under my breath. It meant another trip down the long, winding driveway, back to the parking lot. I considered my options. The main entrance was all the way around the building. A 10-minute walk, maybe 15. But there was the service entrance, just around the side, a little metal door used for deliveries. It was closer, maybe a 5-minute round trip. I could be back here, recalibrating the telescope, before 7:15. It would save me time, significant time. I started walking, already mentally calculating how much faster it would be. The service entrance was convenient. It wasn't like it was forbidden, it was just rarely used. I passed the storage room, the one I'd skipped during that ridiculous ritual thing. The door was closed, a dark rectangle in the pale morning light. I remembered the way the note had emphasized completing it. A little shiver ran down my spine. I dismissed it. It was just a silly note. Probably some bored security guard's idea of a prank. I was already at the side of the building, hand on the cold metal handle of the service entrance door, when I heard it, a low rhythmic thumping. Not loud, but distinct. It vibrated through the ground, through the soles of my shoes. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across concrete. I stopped, my hand frozen on the handle. I told myself it was the generator kicking on, a late startup, but the generator was on the other side of the building, and the sound, it wasn't mechanical, it was organic. Somehow, a dragging weight. I pulled my hand away from the door. I remembered something, a fragment of a thought from that note. Something about not using that entrance alone. It wasn't a clear instruction, more of an implication, a sense of warning. I couldn't recall the exact wording, something about witnesses, or the lack of them. I shook my head, trying to clear the feeling. It was absurd. I was letting a silly note and a weird noise dictate my actions. I was being ridiculous. I turned and started walking around the building, towards the main entrance. The thumping continued, fainter now, but still there. It followed me. I told myself it was my imagination, that the wind was playing tricks on my ears. I reached the main entrance, unlocked the door, and walked back into the building. It took 8 minutes, 17 seconds to get back to the control room, a full 2 minutes slower than it would have been through the service entrance. I booted up the computer, pulled up the star charts, and began the calibration process. The thumping had stopped, but I kept glancing towards the side of the building, towards the service entrance, and I noticed something else. The heavy shelving unit in the corner of the control room, the one I'd checked yesterday, was slightly, almost imperceptibly, further from the wall than it had been, a fraction of an inch maybe, but enough to notice. It was the same thing that had happened with the storage room. I hadn't said anything about it to anyone, hadn't wanted to sound crazy, I hadn't even admitted it to myself. But it was there, and now, it was happening again. I spent the next hour running diagnostics on the telescope's declination drive. It was tedious work, mostly checking connections, calibrating sensors, and logging the data. The motors hummed, a low constant drone that filled the control room. I grabbed a thermos of coffee from the break room, the cheap diner blend that tasted like burnt sugar, and was nursing it slowly. It wasn't great, but it was warm. The coffee helped. I was exhausted, not physically, exactly, though my back ached from hunching over the console. It was a deeper kind of weariness, a bone-deep fatigue that had settled in after months of worrying about the bills. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights, felt like another reminder of everything that could go wrong. I kept checking the account balance on my phone, a nervous tick I hadn't been able to shake. Connie from accounting had called yesterday, asking about the late payment on the medical bills. I mumbled something about a delay with the insurance, promised to send a check as soon as possible. She hadn't sounded convinced. I hadn't convinced myself either. The Observatory paycheck was a lifeline, but it barely covered the essentials, let alone the mountain of debt. Walt's replacement hadn't shown up yet. They'd said someone was coming to see the site. A potential long-term hire, but that was 2 days ago. I hadn't heard anything since. It meant more nights alone, more time to second-guess myself, more time to notice the little things, like the way the dust motes seemed to dance differently in the beam of the monitor, or the way the air felt stale. I finished the diagnostics and saved the log files. Time for a quick inventory of the spare parts. The storage closet was down the hall past the break room. I grabbed my clipboard and headed out of the control room. That's when Ilse, the cleaning lady, appeared. She was humming, pushing a large metal cart filled with bottles and rags. "Good evening, Elian," she said, her voice a little raspy. "Everything running smoothly?" "As smoothly as it gets," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just doing a quick inventory of the supplies." "Good, good. Keep those machines happy. They're more reliable than most people I meet." She chuckled, a dry, papery sound. I nodded, waiting for her to pass. She was blocking the doorway to the hallway. It wasn't a particularly narrow doorway, but she filled it, and as I waited just for a moment, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. Not a gust of cold air, exactly. It was more like the air itself had grown thinner, less substantial, a prickling sensation on my skin. I stepped back. Not a deliberate movement, just an instinctive reaction. I walked around her, offering a small apology. "Excuse me." She didn't seem to notice, still humming and pushing her cart. As I passed, I glanced back at the doorway. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just Ilse and the hallway beyond, but the feeling lingered, a cold spot on my chest. I told myself it was the ventilation system. The building was old, the heating and cooling were erratic. That was all it was. I was letting my imagination run wild, fueled by exhaustion and anxiety. I needed to focus on the task at hand, get the inventory done, finish the paperwork, and try to get some sleep. But as I continued down the hall, I remembered something. Not a specific rule, more of a vague impression from that ridiculous note. Something about doorways, about not lingering, about not being in them. It wasn't a clear instruction, more of a feeling of wrongness, like a boundary that shouldn't be crossed. A sense that doorways weren't neutral spaces but thresholds that demanded respect, a strange notion. I stopped at the entrance to the storage closet, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped fully inside. The closet was cramped and dusty, filled with boxes of spare parts. I began pulling items off the shelves, checking them against the inventory list. I kept glancing back towards the hallway, towards the doorway I'd just passed through. The cold feeling was gone, but the unsettling sense of being watched remained. I finished the inventory, made a few notes on my clipboard, and headed back towards the control room. I consciously avoided stopping in any doorways along the way. I walked quickly, almost deliberately past the break room, past Ilse, who was still humming and pushing her cart. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that something had been waiting in that doorway. Something that wouldn't have bothered me if I hadn't been standing in its way. Something that was still there now, watching me from the shadows, and that the shelves in the storage room had shifted again. I could feel it. I was recalibrating the spectrograph. It's a fiddly process, tightening screws, adjusting lenses, running diagnostics, the kind of thing that requires absolute stillness and good light. It wasn't urgent, not exactly. The spectrograph was functioning within acceptable parameters, but Dr. Chen, the lead researcher, was a stickler for precision. He'd emailed earlier that week a curt message about maintaining optimal performance. It wasn't the content of the email that bothered me. It was the sheer volume of them. Every little thing needed his approval, his oversight. It felt personal, as if he didn't trust me to do the job I was being paid for. The spectrograph room was small, a cramped alcove off the main control room. It smelled faintly of ozone and metal polish. The air was cool, even colder than the rest of the observatory, and the floor vibrated subtly with the hum of the telescope's motors. I had the small portable radio tuned to a classical station, mostly to fill the silence. Vivaldi, I think. Something bright and cheerful. I was meticulously tightening a set screw on the focusing mechanism when it happened. The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a dimming, just gone. Complete and utter darkness. The radio cut off mid-note. I froze, wrench in hand. My initial thought was a power surge. That happens all the time in these old buildings. I reached for my phone automatically just to use the flashlight. It was right there in my pocket, a reflex. But then, that impression. A half-formed thought dredged up from the murky depths of that note. Something about the lights, about staying put, about not attracting attention. It wasn't a rule, not really. More like a warning, a feeling of profound wrongness associated with artificial light in the darkness. I dismissed it instantly. It was ridiculous, a paranoid fantasy concocted by some eccentric former employee. This was a modern observatory, not some ancient temple. The power would be back on in a minute. Still, my hand hovered over my phone. I told myself it was just habit, a lifetime of reaching for a light source when plunged into darkness. I could quickly scan the room, make sure nothing was damaged, then call maintenance. It was the logical thing to do, the responsible thing to do, but the feeling persisted, a nagging discomfort that outweighed the logic. A sense that even a brief flash of light would be noticed, and that noticing wouldn't be a good thing. I lowered my hand. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The vibrations from the telescope continued, a constant thrumming in the floor. My ears strained, trying to pick up any sound. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint ringing in my ears. I could feel my pulse quickening, a tight drumbeat in my throat. I was acutely aware of the small space around me, of the metal walls, the delicate instruments, the wrench still gripped tightly in my hand. It felt wrong to move, to disrupt the stillness. I remembered the shelves in the storage room, how they'd been subtly rearranged. I remembered how Ilse had seemed to occupy the entire doorway, blocking my path. The feeling of being watched, of being assessed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I tried to calm my breathing, to slow my heart rate. I focused on the sensation of my feet on the cold concrete floor. I thought about Sarah, about the bills, about the endless cycle of worry that had become my life. It didn't help. The darkness was a physical weight, pressing down on me, suffocating me. Then, a new sound. A faint scratching, coming from somewhere near the ceiling, like tiny claws on metal. It was almost imperceptible, easily dismissed as the building settling. But it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, and it stopped as soon as I consciously registered it. The lights flickered back on, blindingly bright. I squeezed my eyes shut, then slowly opened them, blinking against the glare. The spectrograph room looked the same. Everything was in its place. The instruments were undisturbed, but the feeling of wrongness hadn't gone away. It had intensified. I looked down at the spectrograph. The set screw I'd been tightening was loose, completely undone. It hadn't been loose before. I was certain of that. I hadn't even touched it since the lights went out. And on the floor, directly beneath the spectrograph, lay a small, perfectly formed origami crane, folded from a scrap of the observatory's maintenance log. It wasn't there before either. I hadn't seen anyone near here all night. I didn't pick it up. I didn't touch anything. I finished recalibrating the spectrograph, double-checking every screw, every lens. I sent Dr. Chen a brief email confirming the calibration was complete. I didn't mention the power outage. I didn't mention the loose screw. I didn't mention the crane. And I knew with a cold certainty that I wouldn't mention any of it to anyone. The crane remained on the floor, a silent paper sentinel. I was cataloging the new astrophotography data from the Hale telescope, mostly nebulae, swirling gas clouds light years away. It was tedious work, checking for artifacts, calibrating the images, and flagging anything that might be interference. But it was quiet work, and tonight, quiet was good. I'd brought a thermos of black coffee, lukewarm now, and was slowly working my way through it. The monitor glowed, bathing the small room in a cool blue light. It was a comfortable kind of isolation, the kind I'd paid a lot of money for, in a roundabout way. The observatory had a peculiar smell. Not unpleasant exactly, more like dust and old metal, with a faint undercurrent of ozone. It reminded me of my grandfather's workshop, filled with tools and half-finished projects. He'd been a watchmaker, meticulous and precise. I hadn't inherited his patience or his skill. I'd always been better with numbers, with systems. Sarah used to say I was allergic to anything that required a steady hand. She'd tease me about it, gently. I'd gotten into a rhythm, clicking through the images, marking the anomalies. The hours were slipping by. It was probably close to 2:30 a.m. The schedule was mercifully light tonight, just the routine checks, the data processing, and occasional adjustments to the telescope's tracking. I'd finished the preliminary analysis of the Andromeda Galaxy images and was starting on the Orion Nebula. I needed to get to the main control room to log some calibration data. It was 3 floors down. I preferred the elevator. The stairs were, well, the stairs felt like they hadn't been dusted since the observatory opened in the 1930s. And I wasn't in the mood for a history lesson in particulate matter. I called the elevator. It arrived quickly, the doors sliding open with a soft hiss. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the ground floor. I remembered something then, a fragment of a warning from Old Man Hemmings, the guy I'd taken over from. Something about after a certain time face away from the doors. Don't watch them. I couldn't quite grasp the reasoning, and honestly, I dismissed it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many nights alone with the stars, probably just trying to be funny. A weird hazing ritual. I turned around, facing the back wall, and leaned against the polished metal. It was a ridiculous thing to worry about, just an elevator still. I found myself focusing on the faint hum of the machinery, the subtle vibrations in the floor. I thought about Sarah, still asleep hopefully. She'd been having nightmares, reliving the accident. I wished I could be there, hold her hand, tell her everything was going to be okay, even though it wasn't. The medical bills were still mounting. The insurance company was still fighting us on coverage. Then, the elevator stopped. Not on the ground floor. Not even close. The doors opened with the same soft hiss, but instead of the brightly lit hallway of the ground floor, there was darkness. Absolute suffocating darkness. And a smell. Not the ozone and dust of the observatory. This was something else, something organic, like wet earth and decaying leaves, or something trying to smell like that. My first instinct was that the power had gone out again, but the elevator's internal lights were on, casting a dim glow on the closed doors behind me. The stopped floor wasn't a floor at all. It was an empty shaft, blackness stretching out on either side. It wasn't a power issue. It was a place the elevator shouldn't have stopped. I remembered Hemming's warning again. Clearer this time. After 2 a.m., face away from the doors. Don't watch. The implication was terrifying. I hadn't turned around. I'd followed the rule, but the elevator had still stopped. It had still opened onto whatever that was. I gripped the handrail, my knuckles white. It was probably just a glitch, a temporary malfunction. The elevator's safety systems would kick in. It would automatically reset and take me down to the ground floor. It had to. But the longer I waited, the more a cold knot formed in my stomach. The smell was getting stronger, heavier. The doors began to close, slowly, deliberately. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, hoping to override whatever was happening. The doors continued to close, inch by inch. The smell was almost overwhelming now. I could feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was breathing on me. Then, with a final hiss, the doors closed completely. The elevator began to descend, but not smoothly. It lurched and shuddered, as if it was struggling against some unseen force. The descent was slow, agonizingly slow, and as we moved, I could hear a faint scratching sound coming from the walls of the elevator shaft. A rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across metal. It wasn't the building settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, I practically leaped out, stumbling onto the polished concrete. I didn't look back. I didn't even pause to catch my breath. I just walked quickly towards the main control room, my legs feeling strangely weak. The calibration data could wait. I needed a strong cup of coffee, and maybe, just maybe, I needed to start taking Old Man Hemmings a little more seriously. The air in the hallway felt thin, stale. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding doorways. I had a feeling I wouldn't be able to look at an elevator the same way again, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the smell, that earthy, decaying smell, had clung to me. It was in my nostrils, under my fingernails, woven into the fabric of my coat. I was cataloging the star charts. Not a glamorous job, but someone had to do it. Mostly it involved cross-referencing old hand-drawn maps with the digital data we were collecting. Tedious, but quiet. That was the biggest draw, honestly. Quiet. After the elevator, after the smell that seemed to cling to everything, I just wanted quiet. The charts themselves were fascinating in a way. Each one was a snapshot of the night sky from a different era, painstakingly rendered in ink and watercolor. You could see the evolution of astronomical understanding, the gradual shift from mythological constellations to precise coordinates. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, and smelled faintly of vanilla and dust. I had a small lamp clipped to the drafting table, a soft, warm glow that didn't feel intrusive. It was almost normal. I'd brewed a fresh pot of coffee earlier, the smell battling the lingering scent from the elevator. It helped. Coffee always helped. I took a sip, scalding hot, and went back to comparing a chart from the 1930s with a recent image of the Andromeda Galaxy. The difference was staggering. The old chart showed a faint smudge, barely discernible from the background. The new image was a swirling vortex of stars, millions of light years away. Around 11. I remembered the time. That's when Hemming's notes had mentioned something about the roof access door. I'd skimmed over it, thinking it was just another item on a needlessly long list. Perimeter check, calibration sequence, roof access. It all seemed a little paranoid, a little old-fashioned. But after everything else, I couldn't afford to dismiss anything outright. I remembered a fragment of the warning now. Something about checking it at 11, locking it if it was unlocked, and definitely not looking up. The not looking up part struck me as particularly odd. It felt weighted, like it wasn't just a matter of safety, but something else. Something about acknowledging something that shouldn't be acknowledged. Probably just a safety precaution. The roof was flat, exposed, and could be dangerous in bad weather. Someone could wander up there, slip, fall. Hemmings was an old man, prone to overthinking. It was a roof door, for God's sake. Still, the image of the elevator opening onto nothingness was fresh in my mind. I pushed it away. I stood up, stretching my back. My legs felt stiff from sitting for so long. The smell was fainter, but still there, a subtle undertone to the coffee and the old paper. I walked down the hallway, avoiding doorways as much as possible. Old habits, I guess. The roof access door was at the end of the hallway, next to the generator room. It was a heavy steel door, painted a dull gray. I checked it, unlocked. I felt a prickle on my skin, a strange static charge in the air. It could be the generator, maybe, or just the building's aging electrical system. I reached for the handle, my hand slightly hesitant. The metal was cold under my palm. I turned the handle and pulled the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a narrow metal staircase leading up to the roof. The air coming from the stairwell was different, colder, and carrying a faint, earthy smell, not the same as the lingering odor from the elevator, but related. Something organic, decaying. I remembered the warning again, more vividly this time. Lock it, don't look up, just lock the damn door. I reached for the latch, my fingers fumbling slightly. It was a simple mechanism, a heavy bolt that slid into place with a satisfying click. As I secured the latch, I felt something shift, a subtle change in pressure, like a weight being removed or repositioned. It wasn't a sound, exactly, more like a vibration in the metal of the door. A momentary resistance quickly gone. I completed the motion, slid the bolt fully home. Then, without thinking, without consciously deciding to, I stepped back. I didn't look up. I couldn't bring myself to. I turned and walked back down the hallway, my pace quickening. The static feeling was stronger now, buzzing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the control room, collapsing into my chair. I stared at the computer screen, but I couldn't focus. I kept replaying the sensation of locking the door, the brief moment of resistance. It hadn't been the door itself. It had been something else, something on the other side. I ran my hand across my face, trying to wipe away the feeling of unease. It was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But the smell, that faint, earthy smell, was definitely stronger now, and I noticed something else. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the arrangement of the tools on the workbench beside me. A wrench that had been lying flat was now tilted slightly upwards. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to know that I wasn't imagining things. I needed another cup of coffee, and I needed to get through the rest of the night. But I knew with a growing sense of dread that the quiet was over. Something had noticed me, and it was waiting. I was calibrating the spectrograph. It was tedious work, involving tiny adjustments to the fiber optic cables and a lot of staring at fluctuating waveforms on the monitor. Useful work, I supposed, but not exactly stimulating. It was nearing 4 a.m., and the only sound was the hum of the equipment and the occasional creak of the building settling. I'd brewed another pot of coffee, black this time, and was nursing a chipped mug. Midge had brought in a box of old donuts earlier in the week. There was a single jelly-filled one left, glazed and slightly stale, but I figured it was better than nothing. I hadn't seen anyone else since Ilsa left around midnight. She'd given me a curt nod as she headed out, didn't ask how things were going. Ilsa wasn't much for conversation. She'd worked at the Observatory for nearly 20 years, and the place seemed to have worn her down to a kind of quiet efficiency. I tried not to bother her. Mostly, I just wanted to get through the night without incident. Without whatever this was. I kept glancing at the toolkit on the workbench. Not because I needed anything, but because things had a way of shifting. Just a little, like someone, or something, was rearranging things while I wasn't looking. It was ridiculous. I told myself it was the fatigue, the lack of sleep, the stress over the medical bills. I really needed to talk to Dr. Ramirez about upping my dosage. The spectrograph finally stabilized. The waveform was clean. The readings consistent. Good. One less thing to worry about. I started running a diagnostic sweep, watching the numbers scroll across the screen. It would take about 15 minutes to complete. Enough time to finish the donut, I figured. I took a bite. The jelly was surprisingly tart. I chewed slowly, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I was being watched. It was probably just the building. It was old, full of hidden spaces and strange angles. The kind of place that could easily play tricks on your mind. The diagnostic sweep finished. A green check mark appeared on the screen, all systems nominal. The closing announcement was next. It was a simple thing, a pre-recorded message that went out over the observatory's PA system, letting any late visitors know that the facility was closing for the night. I'd heard it dozens of times during my training. It was mandatory. I clicked the icon on the computer screen, and the message began to play. Attention visitors, the observatory is now closing. Please make your way to the main entrance. The grounds will be secured in 15 minutes. I started to add, "Have a good night," automatically, the way I always did when I spoke to customers at the hardware store. It just felt polite. But then I stopped. Something prickled at the back of my neck, a faint memory, not of a spoken instruction, but of something read. Something about the announcement, about needing to be exact. It was hazy, fragmented, something about the wording being important, like a specific sequence of sounds. I paused, my finger hovering over the microphone button. I didn't add the "have a good night," it felt wrong. I told myself it was silly, it was just a formality, a greeting. Who would even notice? But the feeling persisted, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Then, a faint scraping sound from the hallway. Not a creak, not a settling sound. It sounded like furniture being dragged. It was subtle, almost masked by the hum of the equipment. But I heard it, and my gaze instinctively dropped to the workbench. The wrench, the one I'd noticed slightly tilted earlier, was now lying flat again, perfectly flat. I finished the announcement, repeating only the pre-recorded script. No additions, no variations, just the cold mechanical voice announcing the observatory's closure. The moment the last word faded, a distinct click echoed from somewhere within the building. Not the click of a relay switch or a mechanical latch, the sound of a door opening, a heavy door. I froze, straining to hear. The click was followed by silence, a suffocating, expectant silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, staring at the computer screen, my hand clenched into a fist. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. I didn't know where the door had opened, or what, or who had opened it. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that something had responded. And it wasn't a visitor. It wasn't Ilse coming back. It was something else entirely. I slowly reached for my coffee mug, my fingers brushing against the cool ceramic. The coffee was lukewarm now, the taste bitter. I took a small sip, trying to steady my nerves. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what was happening. But all I could think about was the sound of that door, and the wrench, and the suffocating feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. I had a feeling it was going to be a very long night. I started my rounds checking the auxiliary systems. It was just a matter of hitting the reset buttons on the environmental controls in the visitor lounge, the small library, and the restrooms. Tedious stuff, but it ate up time. And honestly, after the announcement, after the feeling, I just needed something mundane to focus on, something predictable. The visitor lounge was empty as usual. The chairs were arranged neatly around the small tables, the glass surfaces gleaming under the emergency lights. I pressed the reset button on the thermostat, then glanced at the small display screen. 72 degrees, perfect. I moved on to the library, running my hand along the spines of the astronomy books, mostly coffee table books, really, glossy pictures of nebulae and galaxies that nobody actually read. That's when I smelled it. It was faint at first, a subtle sweetness clinging to the air. Something floral, almost lavender. I sniffed again, trying to place it. It wasn't coming from the books. It was me, my aftershave. I'd put it on this morning before leaving for work, a habit I'd gotten into after Sarah after the accident. She always liked the way it smelled, a small comfort. I stopped, my hand halfway to the thermostat. I remembered something then. A phrase, a fragment, something about scents, about not bringing anything scented into the observatory. It wasn't a clear memory, more like a feeling of unease layered over a half-remembered instruction. It wasn't in the handbook. I was sure of it. Probably just something Ilses had mentioned in passing during the handover, lost in the shuffle of everything else. But the idea stuck. It seemed illogical. What harm could a little aftershave do? It wasn't like I was dousing myself in it. I dismissed it. It was a silly thought. I was tired, stressed. I'd been running on adrenaline since Sarah's accident, barely sleeping. I was letting my imagination run wild. A little lavender wasn't going to hurt anything. This was a scientific facility, not a hermetically sealed environment. But as I moved to the restrooms, the scent seemed to grow stronger, to cling to me like a second skin. And with it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I walked slower, my senses on high alert. The restroom was empty, thank God. I hit the reset button, then paused, listening. Nothing, just the low hum of the ventilation system. I started back towards the main control room, walking quickly now. The scent felt wrong. It wasn't just my aftershave anymore. It was something else. Something that smelled like my aftershave but amplified, artificial, overpowering. And I had the distinct impression that it wasn't staying behind me. It was moving with me, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder. The hallway was empty, but the scent was still there, swirling around me, growing stronger with each step. It felt focused, like a scent trail. I picked up my pace, almost breaking into a run. The feeling of being followed intensified. It wasn't a visual thing, not a shadow or a glimpse of movement. It was a pressure, a weight in the air, a sense of being observed, and the scent was the source of it, leading it. I reached the control room and practically dove inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving, my skin crawling. I hadn't consciously realized how much I'd been holding my breath. I stripped off my jacket, then my sweater, dropping them onto a chair. I dug into my toiletries bag, finding the unscented hand lotion Ilse had left for me. I pumped a generous amount into my hands, rubbing it in vigorously, trying to mask the scent of the aftershave. Then, I remembered the rule. Not the clear statement, but the feeling of the rule. That scents lingered, that they marked a path, that something used that path to find you. I scrubbed my hands with soap and water, repeating the process until my skin was raw and red. I checked my breath. I felt ridiculous, paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake, a serious mistake. I glanced at the security monitors, scanning the hallways. Nothing, just empty corridors and flickering emergency lights. But I knew with a sickening certainty that something was out there, and it knew I was here. I sat back down at the console, my hands trembling. I couldn't shake the feeling it wasn't just in the building. It was coming from somewhere specific. I pulled up the security footage from the main entrance, rewound it. And there, in the corner of the screen, a faint distortion in the air, a shimmering heat haze visible only for a fraction of a second. Right where I had walked through the door, smelling of lavender. It wasn't visible on any other camera feed, just the entrance. The image flickered, then disappeared. The screen returned to normal, but I had seen enough. I didn't know what it was, or what it wanted, but I knew with a chilling certainty that it was coming, and the scent I'd carelessly carried with me had shown it the way. I kept my eye on the main entrance camera. The hallway remained empty, but the air felt different, heavier. I noticed the wrench on the workbench, still flat, too flat. The automatic doors hissed open as I walked out into the pre-dawn gray. It wasn't raining, but the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and pine needles. It felt cleaner than I remembered, or maybe I was just noticing it more now. I hadn't really noticed air before, not in that way. I handed my keycard to Walt, who was already brewing coffee in the security office. He didn't look up. He just took the card and swiped it. "Everything all right, Elian?" he mumbled, his voice gravelly with sleep. "Yeah, fine," I said. Too quick, probably. He didn't seem to notice or didn't care. Quiet night. He grunted. I didn't bother elaborating. What could I even say? That I'd spent 8 hours convinced something was hunting me because of my aftershave? That I'd been meticulously reciting a script like a prayer, terrified of adding a single word? That the wrench on the workbench had been wrong? It would sound insane. Even to me, now in the cold light of morning, it felt flimsy. A bad dream fueled by stress and too much black coffee. I drove home slowly, windows down, trying to air out the car. The medical bills were still there, looming. Connie still hadn't been able to return to work. The observatory job was secure at least. It paid the bills, and the insurance covered most of Connie's physical therapy. It was a means to an end, that was all. I let myself in quietly. Connie was still asleep, her breathing shallow and uneven. I made breakfast, toast, and coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching her. The sunlight was hitting her hair just right, making it look almost silver. I used to bring her coffee in bed on weekend mornings, a small ritual. I hadn't done that in months. I couldn't explain why. It just didn't occur to me anymore. I found myself checking the locks on the doors twice. Not because I thought someone would break in, but because it felt necessary. A completeness. I walked through the house, straightening pictures, adjusting the furniture, not rearranging, just adjusting, ensuring everything was precisely where it should be, a small shift of a frame, a nudge of the sofa cushion. I didn't realize I was doing it until I'd gone through every room. I went back to the kitchen, finished my coffee. I opened the cabinet where we kept the spices just to look. Everything was in its place. I used to enjoy cooking, experimenting with different flavors. Now, I mostly made simple meals, things that didn't require a lot of ingredients, things that didn't linger. Later that day, I found myself scrolling through job postings online. Just out of habit. There was a new listing for the overnight telescope operator position at the observatory. The description was the same as the one I'd answered. The salary was the same. The benefits were the same, and at the end, a single line. Applicants must read and acknowledge the Observatory Employee Handbook, including Addendum 72B. I closed the laptop. I didn't look at vinyl records. Not that day, not that week. I hadn't felt the urge to put on Nick Drake or Elliott Smith. The music just felt wrong. Too much space between the notes, too much silence. I sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. It was a quiet afternoon, a perfectly ordinary afternoon. But I didn't reach for the remote. I didn't reach for anything.